Thanks so much for having accepted this invitation to open our workshop. Those of you who haven't, I don't think there are any here, to participate at a further meeting, we had a very short one, know already that Nathalie Henischer is the author of a big book, this one, Des Valeurs, for Gallimard. But she's now making available her current research on this subject, a pragmatic approach to values, a pragmatic redefinition of values toward a general model of valuation is the title of this forthcoming work in progress.
It has been published two days ago, the paper. It has been
I see.
two days ago in Theory, Culture and Society. So.
Very well. In fact, as sociologist, just 2 words to present her to people who maybe might not be completely familiar with the sociological approach to values. In fact, it's a very ambitious project, aiming at establishing a real common language, kind of conceptual frame for empirical research into an indefinite number of social issues where values and valuation are at stake. We can take any of the many examples she gave in her book, such as, for example, art criticism, movie criticism, theater criticism, but also opinion polls or public petitions, or a nightmare for us all, academic evaluation, or to go into matter we are more familiar with cultural conflicts, or political discord, or axiological justification of legal system, moral system, and so on and so on. So what is my job here? We decided, that was very, in a way, nice of Nathalie. She preferred to have a kind of exchange, in the sense I'm the mediator toward philosophy, so to speak, allowing Nathalie to expound her key concepts, maybe working at the same time, helping the philosophers here to catch hold of some traditional philosophical claims that might indeed go unnoticed. Because, in fact, one of the points in Nathalie's approach is that she insists on keeping her approach distinct from any philosophical dispute about the nature of values. Now, I'm not sure that this is what actually happens in fact, and anyway, it's nice that we have here a kind of a possible comparison of 2 different approaches, one which is in a way, of course, more metaphysical, and one which is quite sociological as this one. I'm a little bit a mediator and a translator, so to speak. So first of all, I would maybe ask Nathalie to present generally this project, and then we go on to the questions.
Okay, thanks a lot. So about the pragmatic meaning of value, and in this paper, I try to draw the main theoretical lines sustaining the new pragmatic approaches of the issue of value, and it's a definition which is most likely to become a redefinition. Under what conditions can sociology address the notion of value while remaining a social science rather than a scholarly support for morals or a normative guide for action and evaluation, as are moral philosophy and moral sociology? And under what conditions is it possible to construct a unified concept of value that would work for all the concerned disciplines, not only sociology, but also economics, psychology, anthropology, philosophy? And to answer these 2 questions, I have replaced a series of familiar but unsatisfactory oppositions by redefinitions, which I think are more appropriate to a pragmatic approach of this object. And so I will just briefly list these conceptual shifts. They are 9, and I'll do it slowly so that you can note and maybe choose what kinds of shifts you would like me to develop after my conversation with Roberta. If we have time, I can develop one or another of these conceptual shifts. So in a very stenographic form, the first shift is a shift from the notion of value to that of valuation. The second shift is a shift from the opposition between value as intrinsic or extrinsic the object to a concept of value as a combination of mental frames, objective affordances, and social institutions. The third shift is a shift from two symmetrical misconceptions of value as an essence or as an illusion, to its conception as a shared mental representation. The fourth shift is a shift from the opposition between values and norms to an articulated set of mental representations and frames for action. The fifth shift is a shift from the conception of value as a matter of price to an extended conception of value as a matter of measure, of attachment, and of judgment. The sixth shift is a shift from the opposition between values and interests to a distinction between public and private values. The seventh shift is a shift from a conception of value focused on things to an extended conception also focused on persons, actions, and states of the world. The eighth shift is a shift from the opposition between value and values, with an S, to an integrative model able to articulate the three meanings of the word value into a one and same research project. And the ninth and last shift is a shift from the misleading opposition between interactionism and structuralism to a distinction between three articulated moments of valuation. And such a redefinition of some basic issues in the sociology of values should open the way to a pluridisciplinary frame for an empirical and pragmatic study of the actual processes of valuation. So here is a kind of summary of my book. And now maybe we can have a kind of dialogue with Roberta. And if you want later, each of you to have me develop one or another item, well, just tell me.
Very well, thank you. So, as you probably understood already from this very short presentation, the so to speak pragmatic turn in Nathalie's way of approaching values is the fact that she focused not so much on a so largely undefined and dubious entity like values, as some things they are dubious and undefined. We will see maybe during the discussion that if whether this is the only possible view. Anyway, the switch from from a focus on values to a focus on valuations, in the sense of, whatever expressive behaviors, speech acts, social acts, activities in which something like a valuation expresses, become observable, so to speak. This is a move which is very similar, in fact, to the one we find in John Dewey's Pragmatic of values and valuations, in fact. So starting from these very large, overarching kind of methodological move, I would ask a first question. Exactly on this point, how must this pragmatic redefinition of values be understood? I mean, does it not entail already a decision which has a very philosophical character? And in fact, a decision which is one of the main issues in contemporary metaethics, namely concerning the status of values themselves, and the claim, more or less implicit, that they are not given, but in a way created or posited by this evaluation. Is that the case, or maybe not?
So my answer would be that values are both given and created. I see no reason to exclude one of the terms, but at the condition that you consider, but that if they are given, it's not by a metaphysical entity, but by the collective set of value resources. An individual has at his disposition a set of value resources, exactly as a grammar on the linguistic level that he uses. And in this perspective, this is given to him, to the individual. But at the same time, values are created, but not by an actor alone. This would be, the individualist illusion, what Norbert Elias called homoclausus, the illusion that people would be defined independently from the others. So values are created not by an individual actor, but by interactions between actors within context. And this is a very important thing. I have to say that the creation of values is made out of three components: the people, the individuals who evaluate, the evaluated objects, and what's very important, the context of valuation. And so there is a kind of creation of values through these interactions when valuations are produced, but of course they are not individual creations. And this is very important because this perspective allows us to integrate two very different traditions in the social sciences and also, I think, in philosophy. The one being the structuralist tradition, which means that there are underlying structures which determine the individual's activities, representations, feelings, and so on. And the very opposite, apparently opposite tradition, which is the tradition of interactionism. Both are totally opposite in the sociological tradition, which focuses on, of course, interactions between individuals, and which takes as evident that everything is constructed through interactions. So these traditions are totally contradictory, but I think that they are just two moments of valuation, because there is one moment when valuation is produced out of this set of axiological resources that we all possess. And this is the structuralist perspective. It's already there, and it partly determines our valuations. And the other moment is the moment in which valuation occurs in a certain context between people, supported by institutions. And then there is, of course, an interactionist perspective at stake in the valuation processes. So instead of opposing the notion of given or created, structuralist or interactionist, we have to consider then that these are but two moments of the valuation processes. Is it okay?
Okay, and Natalie, you'll notice that this move is typical of this thought. Instead of having an either or, you have in a way both of them, and this is the very point of constructing, if I have understood, of constructing an axiological grammar in a way, where in fact you try to describe all the different, so to speak, parameters of a whole global, in a way, account of a valuation situation. Anyway, I go on to the second question now, which insists anyway on one sense of givenness, which might be particularly challenging, at least from a philosophical point of view. As everybody knows, there is a set of properties of things that became very popular in the last century or so, the affordances. And the affordances of things seem to be a class of value qualities, actually, that would favor the idea that values are in a way given, but not given in the sense of inherited in a tradition, in a system of cultural habits and so on, but given to the experience, to individual experience on one hand, and on the other hand, they would suggest that values can be really intrinsic rather than extrinsic to the valued thing. So that this valuation in that case would respond much more than posit a value in the thing. So the general question is, how does your project position itself relative to the issue extrinsic, intrinsic, also with the view of this problem, for example?
This is also a very interesting issue. I have to say that first that affordances, as James Gibson defined them in his book on ecological perception, I have to precise that in French we use the translation prise in order to translate affordance, which I think is a very good idea. It has been proposed by Francis Chateaurenaud, and I think he's right in it. So affordances are not values, because values are representations. They are axiological representations. Affordances are but material properties of objects. This is very important. And so affordances, they do not change anything to the representational status of values. Valuation is a combination of extrinsic resources, that is the representations that the actors have of what is valuable, and of intrinsic resources, which means affordances, intrinsic to the valuated objects. And it is this combination of representations and properties, material properties, objective properties of the objects, which allows us to make valuations. So once more, we don't have to oppose extrinsic and intrinsic, but we have to think that they are two combinated entities which allow us to construct our valuations. Is it clear enough, or should I develop?
Definitely very clear. I mean, you assert that values are mental representations. Now, as you probably know, there is a whole trend of researchers asserting that values are rather, if anything, a mental presentation of things, namely that the valuation is a direct kind of relation, an experiential kind of relation, which would, in a way, make the connection with affordances as, what you can do with things because you receive from them directly a kind of invitation to do something with them without having a kind of a concept mediating it and so on and so on. But my question wasn't just insisting on this point. One can go further in a sociological perspective and saying that, in a way, yes, value are mental representation, but in the sense of very collective ones, actually social constructs. This is a very popular kind of position in at least current sociology or sociological philosophy. In that case, even the very idea that I make a commitment, a value commitment, as an autonomous, commitment, in a way, something I decide to do, would be just illusory. So mental representation in a very feeble sense, in a very weak sense of, something you pick up from the society you are in, and you are just alluded to think that you have, you encounter values and you have, positions of preferences between values, and you do value commitment, preference commitment, so on and so on. So what is your position about this point? So do you share this claim, this social constructivist claim, which makes the whole issue with values from the personal point of view pretty illusory?
So I would answer that everything in social life is socially constructed. So saying that something is a social construction is but totally naive, because it's obvious. I don't see what in social life wouldn't be socially constructed. So it's not the right question to be raised. The question is, if we speak of autonomy, autonomous value commitments, as you said, autonomy regarding what? If autonomy means individual autonomy versus social determination, this, I think, is rather naive, because there is neither absolute individual autonomy nor absolute social determination. Experience is a mixture of personal data and collective constraints and resources. So there cannot be any absolute autonomy nor absolute heteronomy. Once more, you have very well grasped my way of thinking. We don't have to oppose these two concepts, autonomy and heteronomy, but to observe the way our relationship to the world, and particularly our relationship to valuations, is produced along a continuous line between the pole of the maximum of autonomy regarding social data, constraints, and so on, and the pole of maximum heteronomy. That is all. And so we don't have to decide whether values are autonomous or not autonomous. They are just a possibility on a line between this pole of autonomy from social constructs and heteronomy, that is a very strong relationship with social constructs. Is it okay? This scholarly habit to use concepts as discontinuous positions for which you have to choose. You have to be in one camp or in the other camp, in the camp of determination or in the camp of autonomy, etc., etc. It's a totally artificial way to put things. It's a very agonistic way, which allows people to feel that they belong to such a family. I belong to the structuralist family or to the interactionist family, but it has something to do with war, but not with thinking. When you want to think the real way, the actual way in which people live their experience, you have to consider that there are various ways, and according to the circumstances, such or such a position is more or less actual.
If I may, I do have a question. I have a question about your notion of evaluation. Mm-hmm. Now there is this, I mean, the question has to do with, philosophy of mind, basically. And I was wondering what sort of mental state an evaluation is. And the reason why I'm asking that is because if one, as I think, I mean, presumably you would agree in that, but I'd like to hear more about your view on this. If evaluation is at some sort of doxastic state, then it must have some conditions of satisfaction. There must be something in the world that make that evaluation correct or incorrect, adequate or not adequate, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But now I wonder if you argue that values are a matter of evaluation, then what is it that makes that one evaluation correct or incorrect, adequate or inadequate? Uh-huh. Does that make sense? Does the question make sense?
It's a very good question. And it allows me to come back to my favorite comparison with grammar. It's exactly the same with the linguistic grammar. What makes a sentence correct or incorrect? It is its adequacy with the grammar that we use in our language, and grammar, which is a collective set of resources. And it's exactly the same with the axiological grammar, the grammar of values. We all master implicitly, even if we don't know the theory, but we master this capacity to formulate valuations which can be conceived and perceived by the other people as correct, even if they don't agree with. They can say, no, I don't think this film is great, it's not so good, etc. But they accept that our valuation is correctly produced exactly as language. So what makes our valuations acceptable is their adequacy with this axiological grammar that we all share, even if we don't know it.
Right, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the analogy is, as people say, as good as it goes, in the sense that if I look at a sentence, now you're perfectly right that a sentence must, first of all, be well-formed, and well-formed in the sense of the grammar, right? It must follow the grammatical rules of a certain natural language. Mm-hmm. But that, per se, doesn't make the sentence true or false.
Exactly.
Right? So what makes the sentence true or false is something in the world that either exists or does not exist.
Exactly.
Uh-huh. And if we transpose this distinction now to the discussion about evaluations and values, then one could certainly say that evaluations must follow a certain grammatical structure in order to be well formed, but still that doesn't answer the question of whether that evaluation is true or false. There must be something else that makes that evaluation true or false.
Evaluations can be true or false. They don't obey to truth proofs, épreuve de vérité. Truth is not the matter with values. The matter with values is the relative adequacy between the way we evaluate an object and both the objective properties of the object and the context of valuation. And this makes our valuations more or less shareable, more or less acceptable by the other people. And of course, once a valuation is widely shared, it offers the object a certain value, a relatively accepted value. So did you get...
No, I see. Yeah. But then if I may follow up, so let me push you on this point. So it's an example that I usually discuss in my class in moral psychology. So I would like to hear your view on that. So suppose that for some reason we are back in time. We are in 1944. The Holocaust is going on. Nazis are putting millions of Jews into the gas chambers. And on the one hand, you have the Nazi perpetrator that looks at the destruction of millions of people. And the Nazi perpetrator says something like, yes, this is good. It is good to destroy and to annihilate the Jews. And then you have somebody else who says, it's not a German, maybe somebody else would denies that and says, no, it's wrong to put all those people in the gas chamber. Now, if I understand you correctly, we are forced, based on your view, to say that if the Nazi had won the war, right, and everybody endorsed the Nazi ideology, then we would be committed to say that evaluation that the Nazi perpetrator made, that evaluation is correct because it is the one that is more widely accepted.
Yes, I understand your question, which is typically, and it's very interesting, the issue of relativism or absolutism of values. So my answer is that we have to take this question on two different levels. The first level is the level of the researcher who observes the way people evaluate, and then the researcher is forced to make the conclusion, to conclude that there is a relativity of valuation, since for the natives, what we do is good. Maybe you know the excellent books by Johan Chaputto, who studied the values of the natives. So he shows how their acts corresponded to strong values for them. So if you just observe, you have to conclude that there is this relativity, since for natives, what they do is good, and of course for anti-natives, it is totally awful. But this is the level of the observation that the researcher does that is a sociologist, when trying to study the actions representations, which is the level on which I work. There is another level, which is the normative and not anymore descriptive or analytical, the normative level of the answer to the question, what is good or bad, which is a question for the actors, not for the researchers. So if you stand on the level of the actors, then of course there are absolute values, and there are values which have to be defended because they are the right values, and values which have to be opposed because they are the wrong values. So on the normative level, of course, there is an answer to the question you raise, that is, Nature's values cannot be considered as real values. They are anti-values. They are wrong values. This is the normative answer of the actors that you can discuss, of course, but there is an answer. But on the level of the researcher, the sociologist, relativity is the norm, because there is effectively, actually, a relativity of the relationship of actors to values. Okay, yes, I can phrase it another way. In order to have values, evaluate, share valuations, and so on, you have to consider that your values are absolute, that they are the right values, and that you are right to defend them. But at the same time, if you observe the way valuations work, values are relative. And this is a very important statement which has been proposed by Gérard Genette in L'œuvre de l'art, regarding, of course, the value of artworks. Values are both relative on the level of the description of valuations and absolute the level of the normativity of values. Is it clear?
Yeah.
Thank you, Alessandro. I'm happy that you had a way to intervene and keep the debate alive. I think that what Natalie just said, in a way, is useful to understand, in a way, the point of view, the completely empirical, so to speak, point of view of the kind of research she claims to be, and in a way, the empirical aim of the meta-language she's trying to build to allow sociological research on values. In that sense, that in fact what Natalie said, namely the meta-linguistic level of the research relative to the direct or first-order level of valuations and position takings and commitment and so on is right, but it's only right in her sense if we add that the meta language she's using is just for empirical purposes, just descriptive of what de facto happens. I mean, it's in a way the meaning of the Wertfreiheit of the value neutrality according to Weber. It's not necessarily the fact that the sociologist wouldn't take a position in case he were at the first level, but at the second order he doesn't, just because any valuation, commitment, and so on is taken as a social fact. So it's just a descriptive position. Am I right? Am I interpreting you right? Yes. So in a way, if I may conclude, this is not at all completely satisfactory for the philosopher, because in fact the meta-linguistic level of the sociologist is not the only one. Of course, meta-ethicists have the same position, posing themselves at the second order, and yet they do dispute on the very nature, in fact, relative or not. Actually, the question whether any value judgment has, yes or no, truth conditions, and that's the point, right?
No, you're absolutely right, because this issue of neutrality is fundamental. For me, the work of a researcher, at least a sociologist, has to remain neutral. He doesn't work in order to help people take positions and so on, but he works in order to understand the way people take stakes, which is quite different. I understand it is quite deceptive, especially for philosophers and philosophers of values, because philosophers often, well, not all, because analytical philosophers, it's different, but most philosophers are interested in values because they want to propose answers to normative questions. And this, for me, has not to be the aim of the sociologist. The sociologist is a researcher, he's a scientist who is just trying to analyze, describe, and modelize the actor's experience. So if you are waiting for an answer to moral questions, forget and don't read books, there is no answer. I just try to, once more, to frame the resources the actors have in order to answer moral questions, which is quite different. Is Alessandro okay with this answer?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think this is exactly the point. So I guess when philosophers ask the question about values, what they are mainly interested in is, right, how are our moral judgments related to values? What is the relation? And I think yes, we want to see whether there are truth makers of moral judgments, whether there is something in the world that makes this judgment true or false, and what are those things. So exactly. I guess it's a different perspective. Yeah.
Yes, maybe just to complete. if I may, Natalie answer, well, it's not exact that, in fact, philosophers do that because they look for normative solutions to value problems. Not in the least. I mean, the meta-ethical philosophers are not, they can completely disregard the level of normative ethics. They just are, disputing about a theoretical question, the nature of values.
It is what I was going to say, that all philosophers do not have this kind of normative relationship to the issue of values. And if you take Dewey, his notion of valuation is a wonderfully descriptive and analytical notion. It's an empirical tool and not an answer to a kind of more question. And this is why I say I really want to construct a sociology of values, which is not only far from philosophical, from moral philosophy, but also from moral sociology. I don't want to do any kind of moral sociology because it would mean trying to provide moral answers to moral questions, which is not at all my aim.
Now you people should tell me whether I go on just asking some more questions or whether we just discuss freely now. What do you think, Natalie? I would have some more questions to ask you, but I don't know whether how long you discussed already and how. Shall I go on? Post two or three questions?
I would just like. Yes, I think your question number 6 is really important, the difference between values and interests, which is...
Oh, yes, with pleasure. Okay. In fact, also for the public, according to some form of post-Marxist thought, which I find very demeaning in a way. Yeah? Social actors have no real motivation as opposed to their ideological one or real motivation other than preserving their domination, even in the form, as Bourdieu famously said, of their symbolic capital. In other words, motivations are essentially self-interested. And so the question would be, what is the relationship between interests and values in your view?
Yes, it's a very important question because I don't think that we can take seriously the issue of values if we keep on opposing values and interests as it is done in the post-Marxist tradition, that is considering that the real thing is interests and that values are but illusions that actors use in order to hide their real interests. This, I think, is really the kind of sociology with which I want to cut totally, and unfortunately, it's a very, very popular kind of sociology now, owing to the posterity of Pierre Bourdieu. It is a position which totally prevents us to counter values are something which would deserve to be seriously studied. So we have to get rid of it if we really want to give an epistemological interest to the notion of value. So what I proposed in my book is to consider that there are two categories of values, and this is an empirical and pragmatic definition. One category is the values that in a certain context we can publicly the values we can claim in a public context and what they call public values. And on the other side, we have values that we can claim or we can consider as relevant in a private context, but we wouldn't claim in a public context. For example, I like to to take as an example the value of beauty when regarding persons in a public context, such as a committee who has to share a new professional, a new member of a team, a new member of a corporation, and so on. Publicly, people cannot say, we cannot hire this woman because she's really too ugly. But in private, they can say it. Because in this context, beauty for a person is a private value and not a public value, except is this person is a hostess, hair hostess, and in this condition, her appearance can be considered as public relevant. And so if we get rid of this cut, of this dichotomy between interests and values, and if we replace it by this continuous possibility to publicly or more or less publicly claim values, then we can understand that people, even if they have private interests, of course, these interests are supported by values and by real values, even if you don't appreciate them. But they are not on one side totally cynical and interested by their own money or anything, or on the other kind, totally disinterested. They can be according to the situations, more or less driven by values, which, according to the situations, can be more or less publicly claimed. And then you can take seriously the notion of values as something which is autonomous, which cannot be reduced to something else that is, material interest or symbolic capital. And I think it is absolutely important to consider that values are real drives for the actors, emotional drives, moral drives, drives for action, and so on. And this, you can consider it from the moment when, at the condition that you get rid of this dichotomy between values and interests. Is it okay?
Yes, I think it is. I don't know the other ones, but I would have just the last question for you, and then we just open up the debate for everybody. And it's a question in which I'm really interested in, because it has to do with our work, the work we all, in fact, make and which is part of our life. What about, there is one exception of your possible situating yourself neutrally at the second level kind of discourse. And this possible exception is constituted by epistemic values. I do hope that you claim your analysis to be epistemically satisfactory, true or well-founded, or both, clear, well-defined, and so on and so on. Now, what is your attitude relative to these values? Are they just a matter of social constructing, of social sharing habits or whatever? Are they somehow there? Is your claim justified or justifiable or not? That's the question.
Once more, I will answer that as a citizen, for me, epistemic values are fundamental. I'm ready to defend them strongly. Of course, if I'm lucky enough to be paid each month to produce knowledge, it is because there are epistemic values, or very important for me also on this level. But as a sociologist, as a researcher, I do not have to defend epistemic values, but I have to observe and analyze the conditions under which, in certain circumstances, some people defend epistemic values or not, or prefer other kinds of values, or have disputes about truth, about the importance of truth, and so on and so on. So it's always the same answer. There are two levels.
Look, that's a point, Natalie, if I can. I mean, it seems to me that this class of values, epistemic values, is a real exception unless you actually simply don't claim for your actual present speech to be true, or to be in a way justifiable, or to be sufficiently well grounded. I mean, if you're not claiming anything of that, and you're completely happy with somebody who tells you, look, what you're saying is completely arbitrary, and there are no truth conditions to what you say, and I suppose you would say, no, look, you're wrong. In fact, what I'm saying has such and such truth condition, has such and such in evidence, is so and so defined, and so on. So you would be, in a way, claiming that your speech does satisfy epistemic exigences, and so requirements, and so values.
I understand the point, but I wouldn't say in this case epistemic values, but epistemic criteria, which is different. Criteria are the concrete, precise ways in which we can produce our valuations according to such or such properties, qualities that we use as criteria. So, if I stand on the epistemic level of the discussion about our concepts, our tools, our methods, and so on, then we have criteria which correspond to, of course, epistemic values, since they are criteria allowing us to produce truth. And so I'm quite ready to discuss this criteria and to defend this criteria, and to say, for me, it's very important to have such or such a methodology, a concept, and so on. And this, of course, is a normative stand, but a normative regarding epistemic issues, regarding, it's the meta-normativity. It's purely epistemic meta-normativity, the level of the discussion. For example, the issue of neutrality of the researcher is a meta-normative issue, because it's on the level of the discussion, not on the objects which are interesting for the actors, but on the ways we can analyze this object. So the epistemic ways we can do our work. So you understand, it's another level. It's a meta level. And on this meta level, of course, I am normative regarding my criteria, and I defend the criteria of neutrality, the criteria of pragmatism, the criteria of empiricism. But it's a matter of criteria, and it's a matter of meta-epistemic level.
Exactly. So you're admitting that there is an exception, in fact.
No, and it's not an exception, because it's not. It's an. If you take into account the fact that we have two levels of discourse.
Of course I do. I'm asking if the discourse you are holding, you are making now at the second level is true or false. And if you pretend that it's true and it is also informative, then, as I suppose it is, then you are in fact claiming that it does satisfy some requirements, or as you call them, criteria. Now, criteria of this kind cannot but possibly be founded as on value or on epistemic values. So in that sense, it seems to me undisputable that either you claim that your speech has truth conditions and is informative and well-grounded, or you don't. But if you do, then you admit, even at the meta-linguistic level, an exception. Values are there for you.
It's not an exception because it is a different level. If you, if you consider the discourse on reality, there is no exception, I think, to this necessity for the sociologist to remain neutral and not to take any position. If you take the level of the discourse on the actor's discourse and on the other researcher's discourse, that is the meta level of epistemological issues, then, of course, there is a normativity, but it's not an exception, it's another level.
Okay, I think at this point we can really open the discussion and see whether other people now have to pose questions of any kind, not necessarily issues confronting different metaphysics. I mean, it can also be a question of clarification and whatever.